Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, Praise of Folly podcast. I'm joined again by Keith Preston, Swithun, Dobson, and Terminal Philosophy to discuss is the Pax Americana receding. Now, this was kind of your idea, Keith. So maybe you could sort of sketch out your thoughts on this.
Yeah, well, way back in the early 2000s, back when George W. Bush was the president and the Iraq War was starting, I started to think at the time that that was going to be the beginning of the end of Pax Americana. Of course, Pax Americana meaning the framework of international American hegemony that emerged after World War II, because it seemed to me at the time that the American empire was overreaching to the point that it was starting to delegitimize itself and alienate world opinion. At one point, the United States had an international alliance system that included about 100 plus countries. Now, you could argue some of those were bribes, and some of those were puppet states, and some of those were under duress. We were threatened with coups if they tried to pull out of the alliance. But it was still a system that worldwide was seen as legitimate by many people. And the United States had this reputation among many of the world's people, certainly not all, but many of the world's peoples, as a sort of a beacon of democracy, one of the world's most progressive nations and all of that kind of thing. What I started to see throughout the George W. Bush era was more and more international opinion polls that increasingly portrayed the United States in a negative light, where more and more people were saying that the United States was the world's number one enemy of world peace, where people were saying that Russia or China were more progressive nations than the United States, all kinds of things that were a big shift from what you would have found in previous times, say during the height of the Cold War. And I thought at the time that this was probably going to be the beginning of the end of Pax Americana, because more and more nations were going to be, at least implicitly or indirectly, distancing themselves from American power. Excuse me. And that seems to have happened. It seems more and more countries are more or less going their own way. For example, Japan has tried to evade the American sanctions on Iran, and Japan is one of America's closest allies. So have a number of international allies of the United States in Europe. Some of those have gone their own way as far as Iran and some of these other issues as well. So we see this alliance system breaking down as a number of important American allies are sort of distancing themselves from the United States. Also, it looks like the direct military intervention by the United States, by other countries, into other countries, is becoming delegitimized. And I think this is in part of the legacy of the Vietnam War. One of the effects of the Vietnam War in the United States and domestic politics was that it made the draft politically impossible, and it more or less made Americans unwilling to accept international wars if it meant any sacrifice on their own side, like, say, a special tax or rationing of goods and things that would have been commonplace in past wars. There hasn't been anything like that since the Vietnam War. And I think the reason why is that the public just doesn't care enough about war to accept any of that. I mean, they're fine with war as long as they're not personally impacted. But if it's any real sacrifice on their side involved, then it's a whole different story. So increasingly, the United States, starting in the post-Vietnam era, started moving towards using all volunteer professional armies and also client states and foreign armies and proxy forces and guerrilla armies and mercenaries and all of these kinds of things, rather than the direct use of American military forces. And the wars that the United States has been involved in the past 20 years, every one of which has been a failure, seems to have delegitimized all of this to an even greater degree, to where the United States is increasingly pulling back militarily. Like right now, there are fewer U.S. troops stationed in other countries than at any time since the 1920s. Now, there's still a lot. There's still about 160,000. So we have to look at this from a relative perspective. But that's still an all-time low for the last century. And it appears to me that what the Americans are doing increasingly is they're moving away from international, trying to maintain this international alliance system that they had in the post-war period or in the Cold War, and moving away from direct military intervention as well. And instead, I mean, it doesn't mean the Americans are becoming anti-imperialist or less imperialist. What they seem to be trying to do is use other methods. They're trying to use things like international institutions, whether it's political or economic institutions, or use client states. For example, I think they were trying to outsource the Syrian war to the Turks, or I think that was a big reason why the Trump administration put together the alliance between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and then a wider collection of Sunni states were incorporated into that. We also see the wider use of mercenaries, of technology like drones, and of course, there's also things like soft power, cultural imperialism. There's dollar diplomacy. More and more in the future, I think we're going to see the United States moving away from trying to maintain this kind of Cold War type of hegemony, or this kind of neoconservative type of model from the Bush era, where it's all about unilateral use of American military forces, more towards what I just described, which is more of an indirect kind of imperialism. I think they're going to try to hold on to the empire through the use of these other methods that don't have quite the level of unpopularity, say, in domestic politics, or don't have the level of alienating effect on world opinion. So that seems to be where that is right now. But I think that over time, even that is going to continue to recede, and we're going to start to see regional conflicts in different parts of the world to fill the power vacuum in the process.
Yeah. As far as the receding influence of the Pax Americana, I would tend to agree that right around the time of the War on Terror, there were signs that this might be happening. So one of the things that when I was younger, I was really persuaded by was sort of Ron Paul's critique that we just don't have enough money for this. The increasing expenditures of the military budget due to deployments in foreign countries and the foreign wars were crushing. There's no way that the United States could sustain that on a budgetary level. And that sort of critique seemed to have been implicitly accepted by Trump, because Trump certainly had this bring the troops home mentality, where we had the bizarre reality where Noam Chomsky attacked Trump for pulling American troops out of the Middle East. I don't know what to say to that, but, I think implicitly Trump took that to heart. But again, whether you want to talk about the deep state or whatever, the system didn't want to bring the troops home, at least not in completely like Trump did. So I think the Ron Paul critique was probably one of the first ones that I was familiar with, that the U.S. empire was nearing a tipping point. It was too expensive. There was also, I can't remember his name, but a prominent anti-imperialist during the Spanish-American War who wrote The Spanish Conquest of the USA, where he said that by building an empire in the Philippines and in Cuba, the United States would go down the same inevitable route as Spain, imperial overextension, which would then lead to its bankruptcy and destruction. Another early source was Pat Buchanan in his Republic, Not an Empire. He makes the distinction that, thanks, Keith Preston just mentioned it was William Graham Sumner. And also Pat Buchanan, who made a similar argument to Sumner, that if America became an empire, we would share in the fate of all the others, overextension and bankruptcy and disillusionment. And so I was sort of, maybe in the early 2000s, being sort of exposed to those three different opinions. And they seem to be they seem to have a lot of explanatory power as to where the United States was going. And, as we see, like he said, the U.S. empire is now relying less and less on direct application of force and more on these proxies and what we might call soft power, or sort of gray war, which is like, propaganda, messing with cyber attacks and things like that. It's not peace, but it's not a shooting war either. It's that gray area in between the two. And we see a lot more of that as well. And sort of related to all this, in the early 2000s, there was a lot of popular consumption propaganda coming out, especially on shows like the History Channel, the Discovery Channel, and the military channel about the sort of technological platforms that the U.S. Army was going to roll out. They were going to roll out, GIs with these like computer integrated body armor, and they were going to have like, all of these, guns that could fire like, maybe not rail guns, but well, there was a railgun platform, a Metal Storm, and it was just all this crazy stuff. And even then, in my late teens, early 20s, I thought like, how are you gonna pay for this? Like this all sounds amazing, but are you gonna pay for it? And 10 years on, 15 years on, they couldn't pay for it. It was just for public consumption. But I sort of think that the budgetary issue is one of the big reasons why Pax Americana, if not coming to a complete end, will suffer some reversals. And I think that's a really nice segue for your sort of perspective on that, Swithun.
Oh, yeah, certainly. America is not going to be able to fund as many wars as it historically has done. I was just checking. The American finances are terrible. The deficit they ran in 2020 was $3.1 trillion, which is just an astonishing amount of money. And the American and the way they funded this is the dollar supply, depending on which measure you use, has gone. Well, no, put it this way. About 20% of all dollars ever produced came into existence in 2020, which is just insane monetary expansion. And this will not end well. Attempting to cover financial expenditures just by basically money printing, and it's almost naked money printing now from the Federal Reserve and the stuff that they will buy as collateral to sort of increase the money supply with. This is not indicative of a healthy American economy by any stretch of the imagination. It's obviously true that manufacturing has gone out of America. Now, it is true, though, that America does produce more manufactured goods than they ever have done, but the productive base is still not as relatively good shape as it has been historically. Related to this, Janet Yellen recently, basically, I think so the Americans could get more tax revenue, suggested a global corporation tax minimum, where every country in the world would agree to have a minimum rate of corporation tax to obviously stop corporations from moving offshore, where the tax, well, maybe zero corporation tax or very, very low corporation tax levels. Now, you don't need to be a big fan of the multinationals to think, someone is very concerned about making sure they can get a decent amount of tax revenue, because that would seem to be somewhat desperate to try and squeeze as much money out as you can, considering all the liabilities that they have. And also with the American finances, obviously 2020 was horrific, but let's not forget all the unfunded liabilities of Medicare. I can't get the right way around. It's Medicare and Medicaid, or both, and all the pension liabilities. Money isn't going to arrive there. Also, the average age of the American population is relatively high. When I looked in 2014, the median age of the population was around 38. Which isn't as high as, say, Japan or Germany, which were the highest there, about 46. But it's certainly going up. The birth rates in the US are not particularly particularly high, which means that the number of productive members of the workforce is not going to be huge over time, which is either going to mean they're going to have to let more Hispanics in, or they're going to have to engage in automation. But either way, if you have a lot of dependents, elderly dependents in this case, basically on the working population of America, this is not a recipe for lots of funds to go and impose American will overseas. As you and Keith have pointed out, I think more likely then is some more softer sort of interventions. Probably an increased use of global organizations to coordinate international responses. I thought this was quite amusing that, well, perversely, that Boris Johnson had called for global cooperation to come up with a world plan to deal with the next pandemic, inverted commas, which didn't seem to be particularly a good idea. But I could see certainly the Americans jumping on this sort of bandwagon to try and have this international coordination to make sure everyone's doing it the same way, basically how they want it to be done. I could certainly see them doing more of this internationally. But as for, as you point out, as for sort of hot wars, I simply don't see that going to come anytime soon. So that would be my broad sort of economic take on the US and its inability to fund its very strong military for that much longer, well, to keep it the same size at least.
All right, terminal philosophy.
All right. Well, there's a lot going on here, of course, in terms of China and Russia and global trade, potential future wars, resources, and economics. One name that seems to emerge with some consistency in terms of the early days of Pax Americana is Dean Acheson, who was he was the Secretary of State under Truman from 1949 to 53. He advised Truman as his administration was presiding over the formation of things like the United Nations, the World Bank, and NATO, the IMF, and the World Trade Organizations. Those organizations and institutions I just mentioned are more or less sort of the key pieces of infrastructure that made this American led global liberal order sort of a reality. One crucial point about the post-war era is that positive commercial or trading relations with other parts of the world would typically ensure some level of peace, and this strategy was implemented on a global scale. This is essentially what made America into the global financial empire that it has been now for several decades. In terms of looking at this from the view of some sort of like grand strategist, we used Europe as basically this bridgehead as a way of containing the Soviet Union and bolstering post-war Western Europe. And after the Soviet Union dissolved, Europe has been vital for us to expand our influence into the Middle East and elsewhere. As for the present, well, the way in which America was asserting its global influence in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s is simply no longer relevant to the global political situation. There are, of course, many people in politics who believe that a retracting American presence globally is nothing but bad news, and many of these individuals are part of the neocon think tank scene in Washington. I think, for example, Brett Stevens of the New York Times might be one of these people, and of course, there are other non-neocon people who have very similar concerns. But that's certainly that's certainly one group that I've noticed that does sound the alarm bell in terms of a retracting global America. However, when you really think about it, I mean, how long and how intense should America's global reach be maintained? I think there are some theaters of economics and potential war zones that the United States may or perhaps will always play a part in. I mean, for example, I think we pay the Egyptians several billion. We pay them billions every year to not cause any trouble with the Israelis. And of course, Israel has shown itself to become fairly dependent on American military and technological support as well. And as I was researching for this episode, one thing that has become clear is that many countries are happy for America to take up its defense on their behalf. And this is certainly true of Europe, but it's also true of places like the Baltic states. This is where we carry out large-scale war game operations with other European countries in places like Estonia. This is as a way of a way of deterring a Russian expansion to the west. And Russia, of course, carries out its own war games close to the borders of the Baltic states as well, just as kind of like a counterflex and things like that. So that's war games are sort of nothing new there. But Pax Americana is a huge subject. But on the topic of potential warfare, one thing that I appreciate about Keith's U.S. foreign policy analysis and other episodes with Todd is that I consider it a sign of maturity to point out that wars like World War II are thankfully not just over the horizon for many reasons, but for one important reason, which you guys have all been touching on, is that wars are so incredibly expensive to wage in the current era. I think, if you thought it was expensive to field several, infantry and armor divisions in a foreign country, take a moment to think about how expensive modern military hardware is in the modern day. I mean, many countries will spend something like $4 million per main battle tank, and that's not including things like ammunition, the money needed to train the crew, possibly more advanced optics, and about a million other things. And then you multiply that number by the thousands. So, things add up extremely quick. And also, while military vehicles and infantry related things and small arms related hardware are really expensive on a national level, military aircraft are on a whole new level of just money burning. One of the best modern examples of this is the F-35 fighter jet program. When an Obama era Air Force general was asked to give a briefing about the progress of the program, well, at a press conference, he passed out. And I would probably black out too if I found out that the government had spent over $1.5 trillion on a fighter jet program. So yeah, again, as you have all been touching on, these expenditures are just mythical. They're certainly untenable. And I think one last point too is that with a lot of modernization just happening everywhere, especially in places like China and India and of course in other places in the world, in the Middle East as well, there are a lot of countries are probably less willing to go to war to lose some of the infrastructure that they've gained throughout the second half of the 20th century. And, as more tech becomes more available to the average person, I think people are going to be, or countries and governments are going to be more pensive to potentially lose it all in some large war when they probably, haven't enjoyed this, this level of, economic gains, perhaps in some of many of these countries' histories. So, yeah, wars are just expensive, and with a lot of people being lifted out of abject poverty, the possibility of returning to that through war, well, I think a lot of people are willing to figure out other ways of solving conflict. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I think another aspect that needs to be looked at when discussing the decline of the Pax Americana is due to a lot of the over politicization of the U.S. military in recent years. I think there's probably been a pretty severe drop in quality and performance. Recently, Tucker Carlson got in a spat with the U.S. Air Force with their maternity flight suits. This is just patently absurd. Pregnant women can't take G's, and you're going to have to take G's in these flight suits to be a dogfighter. And the real question is, like, how much can the U.S. military actually perform when you're having all of these diversity quotas with women and trainees and everything else? Combat effectiveness can't be good. And I've heard anecdotally from people who are in the armed forces or are in touch with people in the armed forces that with women in the military, there's essentially there's two things that are going on. One is, the men have to do all of the really hard training, and women can just opt out whenever they want. So it really undermines unit cohesion when that, one half of the unit is just not ever going to pull its own weight and isn't even required to. And then the other problem is that lots of soldier privates and even officers are afraid to speak their mind on issues, tactical issues or whatever, because women are just going to, complain to higher up. They're going to say, oh, sexual assault this or whatever that, and they'll be listened to every single time. And so a lot of people are just developing a habit of not saying anything, even if they're on a idiotic operation. And I heard a lot of this where Matt Bracken was being interviewed, and Matt Bracken is an ex-Navy SEAL, and he was talking about what he's also seen from people still on the inside, and I just can't imagine that's going to have any sort of effective cohesion. It sounds like it's just a tissue ready to get torn apart. And there are two different physical standards, one for men, one for women, and women are not going to be able to sustain the strain of battle. I mean, what are they going to do when they start menstruating? I mean, this is ridiculous. But so much of the U.S. military has been overly politicized. One wonders, how much of this is actually going to be effective under combat conditions, even with the leveling factor of advanced technological systems. I'll hand it over to you, Keith Preston.
Well, in terms of the internal character of the military, I think that increasingly the military is going to be more like a police force in the sense that it's going to be used to protect assets in other places and other parts of the world that are important to influential sectors of the American elite. For example, there seems to be an increased involvement of the United States in Africa. And I think the reason for that is obvious. Aside from the fact that you have some of these Salafist terrorist groups operating in Africa, it's also a place where the United States and China, where the rivalry between the two countries is heating up over who's going to control the abundance of natural resources that you have in Africa and that both sides want access to. So I think more and more you're going to see the U.S. basically as being a security force that is there to protect oil refineries or mines and things like that. A glorified security force. And that's what troop deployments, I think, are going to largely be in the future, as opposed to large-scale warfare like, say, Iraq or Afghanistan and things like that. Swithun's point about the economic aspects of this is interesting because the United States has had two depressions in the last dozen years, and I think another one is going to happen eventually. I mean, I don't know if it's going to happen right away, but I keep hearing people talk about how there's going to be an economic boom when everything finally reopens after the pandemic and all that. And I'm like, yeah, a boom as compared to what? I mean, things were already pretty much going down the tubes before the pandemic. So if we get back to, say, almost pre-pandemic conditions, so what? And I think there's going to be more economic recession or depression in the future, which is going to have the effect of widening America's class divisions as well. So we're going to increasingly see the United States have this Latin American class system, even while we develop Western European social norms. And it's going to be interesting to see how that has ramifications for foreign policy. And another issue is the widening cultural divisions you see in the United States. I don't really see those going away anytime soon either. And I think that's going to make it harder for the United States to have a more cohesive international policy, because there's not going to be as much of a consensus, even among elites, about what the policy ought to be. Another thing about international warfare is that nuclear weapons have largely made large-scale warfare between states cost prohibitive. Russia, China, America, India, Pakistan, those places are not going to go to war with each other. It's too costly and too risky. So I think Bill Lind is probably right about that, in the sense that the future of warfare is going to be fourth-generation warfare, where you have mercenaries representing private interest and guerrilla armies and terrorists and gangs and cults and all that kind of stuff, who are really the ones doing the fighting. And I think the American military power will be increasingly used to try to control that, to the degree that it threatens the interests of the American ruling class. Like I said, an example is the resources in Africa that the certain American power elites want access to. And I think we're going to increasingly see delegitimization of the armed forces as well. It's interesting because when opinion polls are taken in the United States, the military remains the institution that most people have the most respect for, as opposed to, say, Congress or the media or the educational system or something like that. But I think that's going to decrease over time as well. Increasingly, the military is going to be delegitimized in terms of prestige in part for some of the reasons that Todd gave. And the number of people who want to join the military, and certainly the number of quality people who want to join the military, is going to decrease. And the military, I think, will assume a less significant role in American life. In fact, the big issue with the military and the military budget is the amount of profits that are generated by the armaments manufacturers. So they have to have some kind of justification for that. But theoretically, you could just simply keep all the troops in the United States or stationed at domestic American military bases, and then still spend the same amount of money producing armaments that you're not going to use for anything. You could just say, "Oh, we're practicing peace through strength" or something like that. But as far as Pax Americana, I think, as I was saying before, not only is the United States going to start to try to use soft power and international institutions and all of that kind of thing more frequently, but I also think over time we're going to start to see less of a Pax Americana and more of the development of an international power elite that's less American-centric, but where the American ruling class is heavily intertwined with the elites of other countries. And this thing that Boris Johnson came up with recently that Swithun was describing, I think fits into that. You're going to have efforts by elites within different countries to coordinate their own activities to sort of rule the world in their own interests. Where you have so instead of having the ruling classes of different countries exercising varying degrees of hegemony, you're going to have, say, the ruling classes of the United States, along with the European nations, along with Nigeria and Russia and China and Japan and Saudi Arabia and all these other places, working together as sort of a collective ruling class to try to manage the world in their own interests. And there's still going to be conflicts, of course, and there's still going to be disputed realms of influence and sovereignty. But I see this kind of global ruling class developing in the long run. I think that's really going to be the long-term model that the power elite assume.
Yeah, Swithin, your takes.
I think that's probably quite likely, the international power elite going from more a national one. Because I was thinking as well, the internal cohesiveness of the United States, whilst overblown its lack thereof is overblown to some extent. You are seeing, as everyone sees, an increase of fragmentation in the US, and so the idea of America to bring peace does seem to be in recession. It'd be interesting to see how well the American military goes with all its sort of diversity trainings, etc., to what extent it will maintain its reputation. I mean, I could see the American military eventually going the way of the police. That was one of the more interesting things from the quote unquote insurrection. There was a policeman who was killed with wasn't the guy killed with a fire extinguisher or hit by a pole with an American flag on or something along those lines? I mean, I could see something like that happening to military personnel in 20, 30 years, maybe a shorter period of time. And if that happens, I think you're going to get the idea of America and America bringing peace as such as America will receive, just because there isn't a strong enough sort of culture identity to sort of say this is America that is doing it. There's also obviously sort of the internal migrations in the US at the moment, leaving sort of California, etc. Everyone seems to be going to Texas and Florida. Now that isn't unprecedented internal movement. I remember actually Russ Roberts claiming that actually the internal migration in the US was actually one of its lowest points a number of years ago, and maybe that was 2 or 3 years ago. But the extent to which the US becomes fragmented means that the justification, the legitimizing ideology, and the way the power elites in America will have to operate will alter, and will, as I say, extend, as I said before, through the international institutions. The coronavirus response has been a perfect pretext for doing this type of thing. I mean, there was actually more global coordination after the financial crash of 2008. So any major event seems to be able to be used to increase international coordination, which otherwise means you have to do what everybody else does, otherwise bad things happen to you. After 2008, the Americans even got the Swiss to retract some of their banking privacy, and basically every continent in the world did, apart from South America, from memory. So, yeah, I think the quicker the internal fragmentation in America happens, the quicker the idea of America bringing peace to the world will disappear, and then you just kind of go for huge sort of internationalism, of obvious international technocratism, which I think is the way it was going for a while anyway. But the internal cohesion being reduced, as I think is probably accelerating it.
All right, terminal philosophy.
Sure. I would definitely agree with the idea that Pax Americana becoming a more international elite as well. It's certainly headed in that direction. One thing that I've been thinking about with this topic is sort of the potential for wars in various regions due to an absent United States. For one, I tend to think that there will be some sort of border clashing between Turkey and Syria, as Turkey is sort of this re-emerging political power from its former Ottoman Empire days. I think Turkey is sort of this, in-between country between Europe and the Middle East, and it would make sense for them to, capitalize on their geography. So I see that as a potential sort of a conflict there, and with less U.S. presence in the Middle East, I can also see Iran emerging as a more influential power, and in that part of the world in general as well. I think you will see Russia, China, and India perhaps competing for, again, not all-out war, but kind of this soft war term that we've been using, and sort of these countries creating their own spheres of influence. For example, I mean, with theoretically speaking, whenever the day comes when America just simply no longer has any military assets in the Middle East, well then, where does Syria fall under? Does that fall under a more a Russian sphere of influence or a Turkish sphere? Are they going to be able to carve out some sort of alliance or with Iran? And so that's kind of the thinking that I've been getting to as well. And then I guess we will also have to see the potential conflict between Egypt and Israel. Again, it's not that these are full-blown wars with tank battles like the Battle of Kursk, say. I don't think something like that isn't going to happen for a long time, as I said before. But I think border clashes and other countries using mercenaries and sort of these proxy wars, like how the United States and Russia has used Syria as a bit of a proxy war. I can see that happening in plenty of other areas. And one other area that we've talked about a little bit is some of these border clashes between I'm sorry, I think it was India and China in that small border region where it comes up by the borders share with Pakistan as well. So I think, again, of course, with the involvement of nuclear arms, things are too risky to just go all out, and I don't think that that'll happen. It is kind of a bit of irony that nuclear weapons have brought about this sort of era of peace, and that's something that's been written about a lot for a long time. I think since really since the 1980s and the Reagan era. So yeah, I think the economic perspective is pretty fascinating as well. But yeah, I mean, with an America that's suffering at home, with a sort of a dwindling consensus about what we should be doing internationally. I mean, anyone born around my time, or when I was born around, in the early 90s, no one in that generation is fond of this, imperialistic America, setting up bases everywhere. And yeah, although it's not like, it's not this full-blown occupation that we're doing, but it is strategic, and we do put these bases around globally to deter other powers from acting up. But I mean, how long that can be maintained, I don't think it can. And for better or for worse, China, Russia, India, Europe, Germany, France, Great Britain, these countries will sort of have to reclaim something of a pre-World War era spheres of influence, and and how those spheres of influences are all maintained is going to be up to sort of the diplomacy of all these countries. But an American-led world order is just is too difficult to maintain financially, culturally, and I think Keith made both Keith and Swithun made a good point in the sense that the American military is certainly slowly sort of morphing into this sort of a police force, of course, where I think troop deployments will be more or less turned into something like guarding of specific industrial infrastructure and oil rigs and refineries and things like that. I think the days of the battle of cursed tank battles, I think those are gone, at least for the time being.
Yeah, and I think if we look at the general rise and fall of an empire, what usually drives the rise of an empire is its ability to project an economic commons over crucial trade route areas, which it's perceived as protecting. And so it's then able to extract revenue through taxes and tariffs and all these other things to then continue to grow. But what ends up happening is, like, for example, during the period of the Silk Road in the first century AD, these empires continue to grow, but the economy doesn't grow with them. So they eventually have demands that exceed what they can extract from the economic resources that are available. And then they decline and fall. Without making any predictions about the fall of the Pax Americana, I do think that the United States has turned a corner in the sense that the amount of value that it's extracting from the economy far exceeds what the economy can bear, even globally, but it's still perceived as needing to protect it. And even if it's continued to perceive as being necessary to protect it, will it actually be able to? And usually that's at the point when any given set of empires collapses, because then they can't actually pay for the maintenance of those, for lack of a better word, services. And I think the United States is moving in that direction. And we've all mentioned, again, the issue of solvency. But through a lot of these financial games, they've kept kicking the can down the road. But, at some point you can't do that, right? There's that old economic saying, anything that can't be done forever won't. And again, when that will be, it's difficult to determine. But I think we can say that the best days of the American Empire are behind it. In order to start wrapping things up, why don't we start with you, Keith, your final statement?
Well, I think there's a process that's unfolding that's going to include several different phases. One is going to be the ongoing retrenchment of Pax Americana of the way I've already described, and then the rise of the kind of global power elite that I've also described. But I think that a global power elite is going to be something that's unsustainable. I think it's going to be something that internally has too many rivalries that it can really to be able to put together a coherent international order. Instead, I think what we're probably going to see come out of that is more like a multi-order order, where it's going to be almost like the 19th century or even the pre-modern era, where you had major powers that had their own spheres of influence in different parts of the world, but there really wasn't any kind of overarching system of hegemony. For instance, I mean, the United States is obviously going to be dominant in the Western Hemisphere, although I think the nations of the Southern Cone could emerge and become more influential in the future as well, like Argentina and Chile and some of those. In Europe, I think that I don't really see the Europeans wanting to move out from under the American umbrella anytime soon, because I think they kind of like the NATO protection they get from the United States. But I do think they're going to demand more say so about all of that over time, particularly France and Germany and the more powerful countries. And I think England is going to move closer to the United States, actually, now that Britain has rejected the EU. That's probably going to push England more towards the USA. And in Central Asia and the Caucasus and that region, the Middle East, I see a big rivalry emerging eventually between Turkey and Russia for dominance in that region. And also in East Asia, I think you're going to see China emerging as the guy that everybody hates. I could see a post-Pax Americana alliance emerging in Eastern and Southern and Central Asia that is primarily oriented towards trying to contain China, which would, probably leading countries in that would be probably Japan in East Asia and India in South Asia. But their principal objective would be to keep China under control, to control China. In fact, they may even cooperate with Russia for that purpose, because I think all of those countries are going to see Russia as a primary enemy, which will probably have the effect. We'll see China as a primary enemy, which will probably have the effect of pushing China, ironically, towards Pakistan. You'll probably see a closer alliance between, or relationship at least, between China and Pakistan, and maybe even China and Turkey, if they both have Russia as a common enemy. And I think probably you'll see a greater alliance between China and Iran in opposition to the Saudi Arabia and Israel and those influences as well. Although China seems to be trying to work those countries as well, so that'll be interesting to see how that works. But we're going to see, as far as the big picture wise, I think we're going to see a multi-order world order emerge. We're going to have all these different regional powers that have their own spheres of influence and fighting to fill the power vacuum as Pax Americana recedes, and probably with a lot more failed states. I think one thing William Lind, the fourth generation warfare theorist, gets right is that there's going to be a lot more failed states emerging in different parts of the world. Where you don't really have the state as in the Westphalian sense. You're going to have more like conflict between different kinds of non-state actors. For example, the kind of stuff that you see in parts of Africa, parts of both in sub-Saharan Africa and in North Africa, also in parts of South Asia. You see this happening as well. Mexico is becoming this, and there's probably going to be more regions of the world like that in the future.
All right, Swithun, Dobson, final thoughts.
I think a multi-order is a possible future, although I do think the international power elite will probably keep things around longer than you might expect. It would depend, I think, primarily on to what extent the economic interests coalesce. But I can certainly see, at least for the medium term, that holding together. Now, how long it lasts is another question, because I do think eventually regional interests and sort of more localized interests will become more paramount. I think that's entirely possible, but maybe I'm pessimistic that I think the international power elite will keep its power for a significantly long period of time. I think how the world ends up after the lockdown things end will be interesting to see to what extent the international coordination is able to hold up. That will be interesting to see whether or not they can. They can't get vaccine passports everywhere. It's just not the technology in half the places the world to do it. But I'll see that will be interesting to see. On the UK moving towards America, I think that is entirely true. Britain has been basically an American outpost since the 80s at least, if not earlier. So becoming more under the influence of America as more of a regional thing, even though we're separated by a huge ocean. That's entirely possible and likely, especially given the current prime minister, etc. I think anyone who get into power would. I think it's a settled view of the British civil service that we are on the American side, and so we do what they tell us to do. So those would be my. Oh, one more thing. China. China's interesting. Keith mentioned this before. To what extent China is going to be a major power in the long run is possibly overstated, insofar as a lot of the industry in China is basically outsourced Western firms. And if they were to decide to leave for whatever reason, the question is, how would this impact China's overall industrial base? They do have a lot of large subsidized firms already that are actually Chinese, but I'm not sure what the proportions are. And certainly it's the case that China is much more dependent on foreign capital than, say, Japan is. So despite Japan's, to go Americans' debts, the Japanese debts are worse, like 265% of national debt is something like 265% of GDP. Japan could well have a better long-term outcome than China. Oh, especially because Chinese demographics are terrible. The birth rate is so low. The one-child policy worked too well. And so I can't remember what year it's going to be, but their population will probably peak in the not-too-distant future, and it's on the way down. So I think China threat is to some extent overblown, but they clearly will be a large regional influence in years to come.
All right, terminal philosophy.
Right. Well, yeah, those are all great points. Just to continue with Swithun's point about China, in researching for this episode, I came to find out that China is investing a lot of money into Africa for a lot of sort of industrial and sort of commercial infrastructural investments, and so it'll be interesting to see what these various world powers have in mind for Africa. I tried to find it beforehand, and if I do find this video again, I'll post a link in the comments of this video when it's uploaded. But it was a kind of one of those atypical geostrategy channels, but it was just talking about this decline of Pax Americana, like we're discussing now. And one interesting thing is that a lot of demographers and geostrategists are concerned about a population problem in Africa with a population boom, but then with the challenges of trying to feed all these people, and so there's this potential. I don't know that there is that sort of looming over the horizon, which I know that doesn't have necessarily much to do with maybe other world powers, but on just in terms of global events, it is quite significant. And as Swithun was saying earlier, China has quite the demographic problem. It also has a fairly unstable currency. I mean, even if you're someone who doesn't look into global politics, I mean, at least several times a year, there's always these headlines about Chinese currency, like, kind of not totally crashing, but it loses a huge amount of its value, and then it has to sort of claw its way back up. And so it's got a lot of currency instability problems. Yeah, I can see Japan in the long run maybe doing better than China because it just has, it has fewer problems, demographically and economically. So, yeah, I think I'll just leave it at that. But thanks for the good conversation, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks again, Keith Preston, Swithun Dobson, Terminal Philosophy. It's been a pleasure as always, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. This is Todd Lewis of the President Fly Podcast, signing off.